Welcome to the Business Growth Spotlight, where we shine the light and talk with business leaders from all over the world who share their expertise and insights so we can all grow together. I'm your host, Heidi Schalk, and I'm excited to be talking with my guest today. I've already learned something through our that behind the scenes conversation. So I've already been having a good time, and I know that y'all are going to have a good time with us as well. If you're new to our podcast, welcome. We're glad to have you here, and stick around to the end because I have a free gift for you. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my guest today, Slater Victoroff with Mythica. Welcome, Slater, to the podcast.
Hey, Heidi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Slater, can you just share with us a little bit about yourself, your company, and your role within it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Slater Victoroff. I guess at this point, I'm a serial entrepreneur, as Mythica is my second company. And my background is really primarily in AI, and I, broadly speaking, like to operate at the bleeding edge of technology, right?
Mhm.
The question is often, what is the difference between the bleeding edge and the cutting edge? Well, the bleeding edge hurts. The bleeding edge means you've gone a little bit too far, and there's some expectation of pain in the deployment, right? Which is to say, deep technology stuff that just barely works, but kind of the very edge of technology. And that's something that I brought to bear with my first company and second company, Mythica, now doing this in the gaming space. And for the last 2 years, really what we've honed in on is this problem of asset pipelines. So when you think of a video game, when you think of all the trees and the environment and all this stuff that you've got to produce for a video game, that's a very slow and laborious process, one that many games like Red Dead Redemption 2 solve by hiring literally hundreds of people in emerging markets to just model trees for, months and months and months at a time. And what we do is we help people plug in a lot of this next gen technology, generative AI and procedural techniques, right, to get new and better solutions put in place, right? The gaming industry is in a very tricky spot right now. I'm sure people are aware, lots of layoffs. The capital is very confused and obviously there's a lot of complications in a lot of industries happening today, right? But people are still playing video games, right? There's still a lot of really strong fundamentals in the market, right, for the people that are kind of able to still develop. It just means that we have to start creating games in a different way, and the games of tomorrow are going to be a lot less these massive blockbuster AAA types, and much more the question of what can you do with a small lean team with really up level technology, and that's kind of the problem that we're focused on.
Well, it sounds like from what you're sharing, you love challenges, right?
I
You go to
do.
the bleeding edge, you love challenges, which is great. You need to be able to not necessarily like them, but you got to be willing to handle them as an entrepreneur. And like you said, you're a serial entrepreneur. And I'm really been excited to chat with you because my son is a gamer and he knows the ins and outs and he's into design and all of that. So he's starting to play around with it. So I'm going to definitely be sharing your company and this conversation with him for sure. So Slater, can you share with me, you said this is your second company. What inspired you to start Mythica?
you know my background has been in AI for a long time, right?
Mhm.
And my previous company was very tech forward. It was very deep with LLMs and a lot of that technology, right? But after I segued out of that, I was the VP of research at an embodied AI company called Neo Cybernetica that was much more in the robotic space. And that's how I got turned on to this 3D problem, really broadly speaking, right? So I'd been doing AI with text and image and stuff like that, right? And learning a lot, right? And there's a lot of really novel and challenging problems there, right?
Mhm.
But when I went into the 3D world, right, when I started asking, okay, how do I actually help a robot, understand this space? I realized that a lot of the foundations and fundamentals that we relied on text, just weren't there in the 3D space, right? Not to get too deep into the technical weeds, right? But a lot of the basic foundations, like when it comes to text, everyone knows how to represent text, right? Like on a computer screen, like we've got, A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever, right? Like we all represent text the same way. We all represent images more or less the same way, right? Totally not the case with 3D environments, right? With 3D environments, even the question of like, how do I represent this thing? Like, what is the data that I use to communicate it is like all totally up in the air, right? So I got really drawn to it. Like you said, I like challenges, I like hard problems, and I'm like, wow, there's so much green field here, and it really was a breath of fresh air. After kind of looking at text and image data sets for so long, it really made me feel like a beginner again.
Yeah.
But a couple of things happened. But the biggest thing that happened was ChatGPT, right? So that came out, and this was technology that I was, kind of very deeply involved in for a long time, and people didn't really expect it was going to be such a big thing before it happened. But then it happened, and from my perspective, not only did we pass some critical performance thresholds, suddenly, this technology that I had a lot of background in, that I was very interested in, was ready for mainstream, but also a lot of the challenges around licensing and IP. My father was a copyright lawyer, so these are the things that he and I have been talking about for the past decade, and it became really clear, hey, there's a role here. There's this 3D AI that I've now got a new perspective on, right? There's a lot of content challenges. And so, over the course of a couple of years, so I appointed myself at gaming basically right away. Not that I had a gaming background, but, I'm more of a tech guy. And so for the business side, the thesis has to be very, very simple. And so my thesis was gaming is the biggest content market. Right. By far, it's just the biggest content market. So I'm like, great, like if there's a way to figure out how to make money, it should be easier there than anywhere else. Yeah. And then, I found some people that knew a lot more about it than I did, and I brought them into the fold. And, over the course of a couple of years, kind of talking with customers, we've ended up here.
Wow. So how does your company, Mythica, differ from traditional gaming platforms or AI tools on the market today?
Yeah, so there's a lot of differences, but what I would say really broadly is Mythica represents like a new way of doing video game asset production, right? And I think to understand that difference, you have to understand how things are done right now. And I think something that surprises people often is just how manual video game production is, right? If you think about creating a rock to put in a video game, you think just intuitively, you're like, okay, video games are technical things. There must be some fancy way to make a rock. But in truth, very often the process of creating a rock is really akin to manually sculpting and then manually painting that rock. But with extra
Um,
complications involved for all of the technical overhead, right? But
okay.
when we talk about like how manually put together video games are, like that's the level of manual. Is really like the closest analogy is sculpture and painting, often from people who are quite literally classically trained in sculpture and painting, right? Like very high quality of art required for all of these things, and these people are not, they didn't go and train in sculpture to be sculpting rocks. Like nobody wants that. But we've got a lot of people that say 40% of game development is just rocks. And if you think, like, you don't think about it, right? But
Yeah.
like the rocks and the trees and all of this background, right? It really is a huge part of gameplay, especially with these open world games, right? And a huge part of the art direction is like figuring out how to actually make the foliage, the rocks, the landscape, all of that line up with what you're trying to do from a game perspective. And yeah, so traditionally all of that is done manually, and we our pitch basically is that there is a better way. And well, maybe I'll take a breath there, because there's a lot of complexity in like the video game production cycle.
Yeah, no, you said about the rocks, and I have my brain going because my son, his friends just went to see Minecraft, and that's like all rocks.
All rocks, yeah,
Right.
Minecraft,
Yeah.
and I think Minecraft is like such a cool example because the art is so lo-fi, but it's such an engaging game, right?
Yeah.
And I think it shows really the fundamental powerful of a lot of the technologies that we're relying on. So we use a lot of these procedural technologies for this generation, or the movie Avatar,
Yes.
right? With
Wow.
all
Yeah.
those crazy trees, right? That's a really good example of like, I don't want to say money was no object, but they had $1 billion production budget. So like they had money to pay for things. But even then, they kind of had this realization that to create the number of trees they wanted to at the quality that they wanted to create them, they simply couldn't do it all by hand, right? They didn't have enough people, they didn't have enough, it just would have been even more insane of a production than it already was. So they had to really rely very heavily on a lot of these procedural technologies, a lot of these things that we're now trying to kind of bring into video games and ask, like, how can we get this level of depth, this level of kind of creation? It's more proven on the film side today, but a lot of it for various, video games are just harder for a lot of reasons.
Right. And when Avatar came out originally, it was just that the technology wasn't even like it is today. It's like,
Totally.
yeah.
You want to know something that's really interesting, is that there's an assumption that so think about it like this, right? So and I want to say CGI and FX is way better than it was 10 years ago, right? But it's actually very unique in that case, right? And think about Avatar, right? How often would you say you see high quality environments like that in movies?
Not like that.
Exactly, right? Not like that. Like you not that often, which is interesting, right? Because Avatar is actually quite an old film at this point,
Hmm.
right? And not to like throw too much shade, right? But the pitch of Avatar was basically like the trees are pretty, right? Like that's it, right? Like no one, I don't want to say no one, but very few people are going to Avatar and showing up for the plot, right? Or like any of those aspects, right? They're showing up because it's really pretty trees and CGI. And you would expect in the decade plus since then, it would have gotten easier to create something Avatar like.
Hmm.
But if that's the case, why hasn't it been done? It's kind of weird, right? If you think
Right.
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I mean, the truth is that actually production has not gotten much easier, right? And that because of a couple structural dynamics, both in film and in video games, right? But in kind of content production really broadly, they don't benefit from a lot of the same technological advancements that like a general technology company would. And a big part of that is a lack of open source, right? I think one of the big things is that a fundamental part of technology is like, hey, this company comes up with something and they use it and they put some stuff back out into the community, right? And there's this like very natural cycle that is the principal reason why what we're building in terms of technology today is different than what we were doing 20, 30 years ago, even if like the tools and computers are fundamentally the same, right? It's like we build and we build and we build, and it is that open sourcing fundamentally that allows us to build on top. Now, for video games and film, broadly speaking, because of how the licensing is set up, basically, very little of that technology can actually get back out into the open source, and so that means that there's very little of this shared infrastructure, right? There's very little of this, hey, this is a really, people still use 20, 30-year-old technology, granted with some updates, but the same like technologies they were using, the same approaches they were using 20, 30 years ago in film and certainly video game production very broadly. And I'll even say in some cases, that's not a problem at all, right? But in some other cases, when you're trying to do this really rich tech forward 3D open world stuff, I think it's become clear that it's just not economical to continue creating those kinds of games the way we've been creating them.
Right, right. So with Mythica, you blend artificial intelligence and role playing. So how do you see AI transforming creative storytelling and player experiences?
Yeah, so I think that the fundamental thing here is about artist enablement. And I think a lot of people have a lot of different approaches here. And I think that the net answer is that it's going to change things in so many ways that I'm not going to say that I know all of the different ways that things are going to be impacted. But
Mhm.
what I'm really interested in and what Mythica's impact is really going to be is the impact on the individual artist and these individual teams. There's this big focus now on very lean teams that are highly tech enabled, right? People that might have been in AAA game production, like one of my co-founders, Jacob Rep, that just got so sick of the slow production speeds, right, and how inefficient game production was, and they left AAA, right, for that, and a host of other reasons. But there's a lot of people in that bucket that now want to create these games with much smaller teams, and they're used to having all of this infrastructure around them, and sort of realizing that because there's not this open sourcing, there's really not this shared infrastructure, so they're very much kind of on their own out on a limb as soon as they leave their company. But I think there's a lot of, largely because of these huge layoffs at AAA companies, there's this large desire now in the gaming space being like, this is not a sustainable way to be. We really need to change the way that things operate because the old model is not working anymore.
Mm. Can you share how Mythica is using AI to empower the game masters and the players to co-create richer, more dynamic worlds?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of different flows to it, but what we really like is kind of focusing on the gray box flow. And what I'll say there at a really high level is Typical game production, you start at like a really low fidelity. So say like if I'm mocking up whatever the castle where you meet the king and he gives you the quest, right? I'm gonna start with like a really low level of detail there. I'm gonna drag boxes around, right? I'm gonna be like, oh, there's a throne over there, but I'm not gonna put an actual throne there. I'll put a cube there or something, right? And so I started this very low level of fidelity, and we kind of iterate on that level, right, until it all feels right to us. And it's this very serial, very linear process then where the art is kind of iteratively refined. And then, at the very end of production, you get something that actually looks like a castle and a throne room, and, everything looks pretty and beautiful and the lighting is right. And then you ship the game. Now, the problem is that in that flow, in that process, it's actually like very unempowering, right? Because that's a very waterfall, super old school process, right? If you think about it in like enterprise tech terms, right? And the problem with that is that video game designers are like very agile. They want to change things a lot more actively. And if you find and you only do really playtesting and bring players in at the later parts of the cycle. So if you're bringing someone into this fully, beautiful throne room and you're like, hey, actually, like the rug up to the throne is too short. It needs to be longer to really give the king that sense of majesty. Let's say, a small tweak like that.
Right.
You have to rechange everything, kind of sculpt it from the base up. You have to change all the cobblestones around it. You have to make new carpet pieces. You have to repaint the carpet, right? To the point where even a small tweak like that, if you find it late in production, takes months and months and months, right? At a AAA studio, right? If you're super efficient and like lean and small, maybe it only takes weeks, but it's a very, very long and difficult process. Now, with Mythica's tools, the process works fundamentally different. Rather than having this be a totally serial process, these two functions can work in parallel, right? So our tools, generally speaking, like there's asterisks around this, but this is a way of production that people really seem to like, is we consume that low fidelity and we produce something that is high fidelity. So the idea is the artist can work on something that just very generically says, okay, hey, I have a cube coming in. What do I want that cube to look like? And then they can kind of take a whole level and say like, okay, now I'll apply it to this cliff, apply it to this rock over there, that rock over there, right? And it happens automatically. And the key thing is that then both of these functions can kind of work in parallel, and that like artification, that like sculpting process is not like weeks and months, but is kind of the press of a button and sort of seconds to, maybe hours if you've got a really huge game.
Yeah, which I'm sure is appreciated by many.
Yeah, well, I think
Yeah.
people like the ability to iterate more. So getting only one or two iterations on your art direction instead of like 100 iterations on the art that you're producing before you ship it, I think it makes a really big difference to people.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all of that. I can only imagine the detail that's involved and the steps involved and the time involved in creating just one small section of a game. A lot of games have different levels. I can only imagine how those levels, how long it takes for them to evolve. You know?
Yeah, I mean it takes years. I
Yeah.
think some of my favorite games like Kenshi and Stardew Valley, they're literally, people worked for over a decade just,
Wow.
meticulously crafting every detail, really, labors of love.
Yeah,
Um,
that's just amazing. Can we talk a little bit about growth now? And because
yeah.
you built two businesses. Can you share with us some of the challenges that you faced in your growth of Mythica, and maybe some that you're going through right now, and how you've overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, and there's so many great areas to dig into, but I think one that I want to really focus on, and this maybe actually I'll contrast Indico and Mythica a little bit, and it's a little bit like old versus new way of thinking, right? So Indico, my last company, very enterprise driven, insurance, financial services kind of customers, Fortune 500 clientele, that kind of approach. Um, and the traditional model of sales there is that you have salespeople and you give them each territory, right? And they kind of each have quotas, and they rely on closing like a certain number of customers in every like period of time. And now the problem there is that it's like very linear growth kind of mentality, right? It's like, okay, if I want to close more sales, what do? Well, I hire more salespeople, right? in practice it ends up being worse than linear, right? Because in your mind you're like, okay, well, if I want twice as many sales, I get twice as many salespeople, but now I need a manager, now I need to do some rev ops, right? And the question, like, is that going to be more overhead or less? In any case, I actually think nowadays, like, linear growth, unless you've got crazy good margins, is not really sustainable for a business, right? People are looking for more than that. And it won't allow you to be very capital efficient. And so something that I've been really focused on in Mythica is like, okay, how do we get out of that traditional sales model? And we're really focused on PLG, sort of product led growth. And making sure we have an effective like PLG model in place, which is not in place yet, but that's kind of our strategy. That's what's upcoming for us, and we really want to rely very heavily on open source and the open source community, and that as kind of like one of our primary channels, and doing a lot of things really differently from a growth and sales perspective is trying to align our interests with the community more broadly, so that when they win, we win. And then also kind of setting it up so that we have like more manageable engagements with our customers, where we're kind of making things easier for everyone as time goes on, and really making sure that the value that we deliver, that we'll be delivering more value to the customers that we have 3 years from now in less time than we are today.
Mm. Yeah, I was going to ask you what the role of community plays in the success of Mythica. And how are you cultivating those loyal users and storytellers onto your platform?
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting because we've got two different dynamics. We find ourselves in a position where we're really trying to advocate for open source in gaming, just broadly and generally, right? Um, Open source, as I've said, is not a really big thing in gaming. I think that there's a lot of desire to change that. There's been a lot of like breakthroughs, and I think individual people that have started open sourcing things really recently, and a couple of like very notable success stories that make people kind of like, okay, there's something here, I should look into it. And that's a really key part of our community, right? And the open source community broadly, like if we talk about sort of the Mythica community, those are the people that we put at the center of everything. And these are people that are, making tree generators and mushroom generators, right? And, collaborating with each other, and putting stuff out into the open source so that game developers everywhere can make more cooler stuff, right? And they're doing it sort of with this hope and promise that their tools actually can be in games, right? And I think we have a Discord there, right? We've been launching competitions that I think are actually, they're working very, very well, that we're very happy with. And a lot of it really is just like boots on the ground, like we're talking to people one-on-one. We've got Sam, sort of our community manager, flying around and making sure that he can spend FaceTime with a lot of our community members sort of as much as possible. Yeah, and really just trying to approach the community with like a give first mentality. I think that nowadays, really, that is the best way to grow a company, is like people's like BS meters are like really, really high. So I think if you approach a community with like extractive intentions of like, what can you do for me, it's very hard to actually cultivate a successful community. So we're trying to very much figure out like, what can we give to people, what can we give away for free, what can we get people developing on that they will actually like get use from. And we actually like, yes, hopefully as we continue to excel there, we'll be able to deliver more value to our customers, and we'll be seen as like more of an expert. But we actually see it as a sort of like a separate piece of community and like a separate arc from our customer growth, like related but separate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I love that you said that, because in the world of AI and technology, which you're in, relationship is obviously what you're sharing is still in the forefront. It's still important. It's highly important actually to the success of your business and growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Like
Yeah.
so many things at the end of the day are people.
Yeah. So how are you balancing scalability with the deeply personal creative nature of role-playing games?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. We're still working on it. I think right now, one of the big like insights we've had, or something that feels a little bit like a secret weapon, but we still have to figure out how to leverage it a little bit more intentionally, is Discord. So I think a lot of people know Slack or like Microsoft Teams or things like that. Or, they probably know Discord too, right? But that's something that they use with friends or around games or something like that. We actually run our whole company on Discord. We shut down Slack a while ago, and we just do everything on Discord. Now, the reason why I think that's a hack, and we still have to get this working in a good way, but what this allows us to do is actually have a lot of things that we would traditionally consider like secret or private company communications and have them out in the public in a way that the community can engage with it. Right. And especially for us, like we're doing AI stuff and we're trying very much not to be, the spooky person behind the curtain. Right. And a big part of that is just being upfront and sharing as much as we can with as many people as we can.
Can you share what have been some of your biggest lessons growing a tech forward company?
Gosh. Content is really expensive
Mm.
and quality matters a lot. And I think, I don't know, as someone that just like, I try to get around this as much as possible. And there is definitely a balance that's got to be hit. But I also think, like, for someone specifically for me coming from more of a tech background, right? It's like I have a tendency to like minimize the importance of production value, right? And I think, for me, I watch a YouTube video and to me, like, this is a talking head. And I'm like, how hard could that possibly be? But now that I've actually spent some time on like, hey, we're trying to produce content, put it out, you see how meticulous the editing is. You see the fact that these people actually have, probably really expensive, video and streaming setups. Like there's a lot of technology and often like a whole team that comes around to make these things happen.
Mm.
And yeah, and I think when it comes to like putting yourself out there and actually communicating yourself to the community, like authenticity is very, very important, but authenticity still needs high production value if it's going
Yeah.
to be understood well, at least today.
Yeah. So what is your biggest goal for Mythica and you and your team for 2025?
A million sales, which I say,
I love it.
yeah, I mean, like always, I think sales, is always like the most important thing, and I think we're staying really focused there, and trying to bring people in the door. But broadly speaking, this open source community, that's something that we really want to see kind of proliferating in a deeper way. In terms of like our growth strategy and our growth trajectory, if you will. We work at relatively high ASPs, with a relatively small number of customers. And so our projection is only 10 closed customers by the end of the year. And that actually like ends up like very nicely from like an ARR perspective.
Mm.
But the point is that this PLG motion and this community growth is something that we're hoping to kind of build through this year, and like we really need to get that. The flywheel has sort of started to turn, but we want it really going fast. We want to see like open source contributions happening in a cyclical way. And right now we see a lot of people contributing into the open source repo and some people using stuff from the open source repo. But we don't see yet is people taking things from the open source repo, editing and improving them, and contributing them back to the open source repo.
Mm.
Hopefully that will happen soon. It just hasn't happened yet. But sometime this year, I'm hoping that we start to see that loop in a much more dynamic way.
Who is your with your 10 that you want to, that you want to create by the end of the year and the million sales? Who is your target market?
Game studios at kind of the double A and above categories, right? And
Okay.
people that are very specifically trying to make more with less, right? People that have kind of heard about Gen AI and procedural technology and Houdini, but have sort of been like, wow, there's a lot of technical challenges in actually getting that stuff up and running. I'm not sure I have the time or energy, but I also don't have necessarily the budget to go out and hire, the 100 artists that I would love to hire for this project.
Mm.
And so anyone that's in that situation, I think we can help.
Now, visibility matters, obviously, in order for them to see you. So, what are the ways the market, marketing wise, how do you get in front of your ideal target market audience or client, and what's worked for you, and maybe what are some strategies you've tried that were like that just doesn't work for us?
Yeah, I mean, gaming is really particular and tricky. It's a lot of in a way that I think gamers will appreciate. Game developers are a bunch of weirdos that it's kind of like it's a niche, relatively insular community that is actually not that large, right? Everyone is, like second, third degree from everyone else. And even after just being in the space for like 2 years, like Mythica is a relatively known quantity, not due to any like of our own not because of ourselves, but just because it's a small space, right? Now, there's a big difference between that and actually getting into the average like tech artists and individuals, right? There's kind of a sense of scale. And so what we have on the one hand is like we just go to conferences. That's actually like really big. A lot of people are there. And for some kinds of connections, right, there's a lot of like, I don't know, there's a lot of good energy at conferences. We were at GDC. GDC was really big for us. But we also have these contests that I alluded to. And these are run through our Discord. And the idea is that we have procedural art contests. And, it's a lot of students that come in and compete. We have cash prizes, say, come up with mushroom generators and tree generators. And the idea is that all of the submissions are put into the open source. And the winners just get a cash prize. No ownership changes hands. So the idea is like everything is open source either way. And you just get a prize for the recognition of what you did. And it was so great, but those have been really good, and I think those have been working really well for us, and we really hope that we can kind of accelerate that and kind of continue to expand a lot of those initiatives into the year, and bringing the tech artists in through those paths. Yes, a lot of the people that compete are students, but you also get the freelancers that might work at multiple studios that can then bring us in there, right? You might also have, the AAA tech artist that just happens to be between jobs because they just got laid off and they're like, whatever, this sounds fun and it's open source, so I'll be giving back to the community, right? So these are kind of like a number of different paths. We're still trying to find more. We are we're podcasting, we're putting out portfolio pieces, we're doing a lot of stuff, and trying to stay really diligent on being experimental about it and just kind of measuring like what happens, what kind of impressions do we get, right? Because we're still early in that journey, like
Yeah.
it's not working yet for us. We just have some successful experiments and some more experiments to run.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, 10 clients that really that's the main goal. Plus, obviously, you want a lot of sales. If I could give you a magic wand and you can go poof on one issue that could hold you back from achieving that this year, what would it be and why?
I mean, how big can I get with this magic wand? Um, write the capital structures in the gaming industry right now.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's unfortunate. I think one of the biggest issues right now is the macro climate, right? Especially in games, it's like very bad. Like when there's a Wikipedia article being written about the layoffs in your industry, like things are bad, right?
Mhm.
And it's really aberrational, right? And I mean, there's a reason for it. Like, a lot of capital kind of flooded into the industry, and then, kind of a lot of those streams were cut off, and there's a lot of there's just a lot of macroeconomic chill right now, right? And so if I had to change anything, it would be that. But I don't know, something smaller might be easier.
What does success look like for you this year, Slater?
Closing those 10 clients and having like a vibrant open source community that we're really proud of, where we're not even sending most of the messages in Discord.
Nice. That's exciting. Well, is there anything that you want to share that I didn't get to touch on before we wrap up?
Nothing huge. I mean, I'll just like blow my trumpet of open source video game development like again and again. I think that it's really really key, and I think that that's one of the big like underestimated pieces of how gaming is going to get through this knothole, right? Sort of this existential crisis in video game development that the industry has kind of come across. I think that it's it's a normal reaction for people to like hug their cards really close and not want to share anything. But I think that the way that we get through this is together. And I think if people get more comfortable sharing resources, we're all going to get better games. And again, like people haven't stopped playing games. Publishers just don't have any money. So, I think we can get through that, and open source is the answer.
Yeah, the collaboration is key. And I always say we're better together, right? We can all support each other and raise each other up. Can you share, Slater, how people can connect with you if they're listening? They're like, I want to reach out, or I want to connect. I want to learn more. How can they reach you? How can they connect with you?
Always feel free to just grab me on LinkedIn, Slater Victoroff. I've got a very unique name. Thankfully, makes it easy for me to Google. And go to mythica.gg. See us out. You can join the Discord. You can see us on LinkedIn. Reach out to Sam Kaminer, who's our director of community. He'll be even more responsive than I am.
Perfect. And we're going to have all of their information in the show notes as well. So you can always grab it there along with learning more about Slater and the company. Again, go to mythica.gg to check it out. Reach out to Sam, reach out to Slater, connect on LinkedIn, and learn more. This is a very exciting company, and I'm excited for what's coming for you. Yeah, absolutely. If you are watching Slater and I on YouTube and you want to keep learning more and hearing more from our amazing guests, then hit that subscribe button so you can see more of our guests, just like you heard from Slater today. If you know somebody that could learn from our conversation, please connect them with us so they can reach out to Slater and learn more about Mythica. And if you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, we would love a review, especially if it's 5 stars. That helps us share Slater, Mythica, and as well as all of our guests with more of the world. So our guests can share their expertise and insights and amazing companies and what they do with more people. Again, Slater, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really grateful for your time. This has been amazing. Stick around. Don't leave me when I say goodbye to everybody, by the way.
Yes. No, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I will stick around.
And if you're watching us on YouTube, check out the color of the room, people, because this color is amazing. That's what we were talking about behind the scenes. It's called Gentleman's Gray, but it's a beautiful blue. It's amazing. I love it. I'm saving that color for a future room down the road. So
2025 is the year of Gentleman's Gray. You heard it here
yes,
first.
it is. It's coming. It's the new trend. So thank you for listening. I promised you all a gift, my new listeners. So if you are trying to grow your visibility and you've been doing all the things that you feel like you're supposed to be doing to get more in front of your ideal people and create more sales inside of your business, and it's just not getting where you want it to go, then go grab our Spotlight to Scale blueprint. You can go to spotlighttoscale.com/blueprint to go grab that for free. And one last time, go to mythica.gg, connect with Slater on LinkedIn as well as Sam, and we will see you on the next episode of the Business Growth Spotlight.